You were taught that governments run the world, that when something matters, space, defense, communication, the state is in charge. Budgets are approved. Agencies are created. Long plans are announced. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the most critical missions governments rely on today are no longer executed by governments at all. When rockets must launch, when satellites must be deployed, when access to space cannot fail, they don't wait for public systems. They call one private company. This isn't about technology. It's about speed. And speed is quietly replacing authority. You might believe governments still hold the final power, but power doesn't belong to who decides. It belongs to who delivers. And the moment execution becomes more reliable than permission, control starts to move. So how did one company become faster than the governments that once controlled space? For decades, space was the ultimate symbol of government power. Only nations could afford it. Only states could justify it. Rockets were slow, expensive, and political by design. That slowness wasn't a flaw. It was the system. Public space programs were built to avoid failure, not to optimize speed. Layers of oversight, layers of approvals, layers of caution. Because when taxpayer money funds ambition, safety becomes bureaucracy. You were told this was necessary, that public control meant stability, that private companies couldn't be trusted with something this important. And for a long time, that belief held. But then something changed. While agencies debated timelines, a private company focused on one brutal metric: execution. Not policy, not optics. Results. Launch after launch, failure, iteration, correction, then speed. What governments once did slowly and ceremonially, this company began doing repeatedly and reliably. And suddenly, something unthinkable happened. Governments didn't just cooperate, they depended. You might think dependence means partnership. But in systems of power, dependence always has a direction. Whoever executes faster eventually writes the rules for everyone else. And once that line is crossed, authority doesn't disappear. It relocates. But why were governments willing to surrender execution in the first place? You were told governments lose power when they lose money. That budget cuts weaken influence. That authority fades when funding disappears. But that belief misses the real mechanism. Governments didn't lose power because they ran out of money. They lost power because they ran out of speed. Public systems are built to protect against failure. Every decision must survive committees, oversight, and political risk. That process creates legitimacy, but it destroys velocity. For decades, velocity didn't matter. Space moved slowly. Launch windows were rare. Failure was tolerated because repetition was impossible. Then SpaceX entered with a different assumption. Failure wasn't something to avoid. It was something to iterate through. Launch fail. Fix launch again. While public systems optimized for approval, SpaceX optimized for repetition. And repetition creates learning curves no committee can match. You might think governments could simply copy that model, but they can't. Public systems are punished for failure. Private systems are allowed to learn from it. That difference compounds. Over time, SpaceX didn't just become cheaper. It became predictable. And predictability is the currency governments value most. When a mission cannot fail, troop communications, navigation, surveillance, reliability matters more than ownership. So governments made a rational choice. They outsourced execution, not because they were weak, but because they were slow. And once execution leaves the building, power quietly follows it. But outsourcing execution creates a risk most people never think about. At first, dependence doesn't feel dangerous. It feels efficient. Governments still write the contracts. They still define the missions. They still appear to be in control. But systems don't respond to appearances. They respond to leverage. When one company becomes the fastest path to orbit, alternatives stop being funded. Public launch systems age. Private competitors fall behind. Capacity narrows. And dependence deepens not because of coercion, but because of convenience. You've seen this pattern before. In supply chains, in software platforms, in payment networks. The moment switching becomes painful, power has already shifted. You might believe governments can always rebuild capability if needed, that they can step in during emergencies. But capability isn't stored on paper. It lives in people, processes, and repetition. When launches stop, experience decays. When experience decays, recovery slows. And when recovery slows, dependency hardens. This isn't about trust. It's about inertia. Once systems align around a single executor, everything downstream adapts to that reality. Budgets, timelines, risk models. Over time, asking, who controls this, becomes the wrong question. The real question becomes, who can replace it if it fails? And if the answer is no one, then power has already changed hands. Without a vote, without a law, without resistance. So where is the exact moment this quiet shift became irreversible? The turning point didn't arrive with a headline. There was no announcement that governments had crossed a line. No moment where authority was officially transferred. It happened quietly. When reliability became more valuable than control, for governments, space missions aren't symbolic anymore. They are operational. Satellites guide navigation, communications, defense, and finance. Delays cost more than money. Failures cost credibility. In that environment, execution stops being optional. It becomes existential. SpaceX didn't win because it lobbied harder. It won because it removed friction. Reusable rockets shortened timelines. Standardized launch systems reduced uncertainty. Rapid iteration collapsed learning cycles. While public systems required years to adapt, SpaceX adapted between launches. This created a new rule most people missed. The fastest executor sets the baseline everyone else must follow. Once that baseline is established, authority reorganizes around it. Contracts follow reliability. Budgets follow contracts. At that point, dependency is no longer a choice. It's a structural outcome. You might think governments accepted this because it was cheaper. But cost was only the surface benefit. The deeper reason was risk transfer. By outsourcing execution, governments outsourced failure. If a launch succeeds, the system works. If it fails, responsibility diffuses. Execution monopolies don't just move faster. They absorb uncertainty others cannot afford to carry. That is the moment the shift became irreversible. Not when SpaceX launched more rockets, but when institutions restructured themselves around reliability. But if execution monopolies are this powerful, what does that mean for future control? This story isn't really about rockets. It's about how power works in modern systems. We are taught to look for authority in titles, laws, and institutions. But in complex systems, authority follows execution. Whoever removes friction becomes indispensable. Whoever becomes indispensable gains leverage, even without asking for it. That pattern repeats everywhere. In software, platforms that ship faster define standards. In finance, networks that settle faster attract liquidity. In logistics, systems that deliver reliably reshape supply chains. Execution is not a tactic, it's a position. You might believe control comes from ownership. But ownership without execution is symbolic. It looks powerful, until something breaks. The uncomfortable lesson is this: power no longer belongs to who declares responsibility. It belongs to who absorbs complexity. SpaceX didn't take power from governments. Governments handed it over. Slowly, rationally, and without resistance. Not because they were careless, but because the system rewarded speed over sovereignty. Once you see this, it becomes impossible to unsee. You begin to notice where execution has quietly replaced authority in your own life. Which platforms you depend on. Which systems you can't easily leave. Which services you trust more than institutions. This isn't a warning, it's a map. Because understanding how execution concentrates power is the first step toward navigating it intelligently, instead of being surprised by it. So where does this leave you in a world run by execution, not permission? This shift didn't stop with rockets. It set a precedent. Once governments normalized relying on a private executor for something as critical as space access, the logic spread. Infrastructure no longer had to be owned to be controlled. It only had to be reliable. Today, more state functions quietly depend on private systems that move faster than public ones. Cloud platforms host government data. Private networks move money and information. Commercial satellites shape communication, navigation, and security. SpaceX is simply the most visible example, because space makes dependence obvious. The deeper change is psychological. When institutions learn that speed solves problems faster than authority, they start designing around execution, not sovereignty. Policies adapt to what works. Budgets follow what delivers. Capability migrates to whoever removes friction. You might assume this is temporary. that governments will eventually reclaim control, but systems rarely reverse when they are working. Once reliability is outsourced, rebuilding internal capability becomes politically difficult, economically expensive, and operationally slow. Voters don't reward redundancy. Markets don't reward patience. Crises don't wait. So the future isn't one where governments disappear. It's one where they increasingly coordinate around private executors who define what possible looks like. That doesn't make those companies villains, but it does change where leverage lives. And leverage, once concentrated, rarely spreads itself back out. So in a world ruled by execution, where does real responsibility actually sit now? If this story felt unsettling, that's intentional. Not because something is wrong, but because something important has changed. We live in a world where speed quietly outruns authority, where execution reshapes power faster than laws can follow, and where dependence forms long before anyone names it. RIN. Wealth exists to help you see these shifts early, not to alarm you, but to orient you. Because once you understand how power actually moves, you stop mistaking titles for control. You stop assuming stability is permanent, and you start thinking differently about where leverage really lives. This channel isn't about companies. It's about systems, and about learning to navigate them with clarity instead of surprise. If you're here, you're not just watching stories. You're learning how the modern world quietly reorganizes itself. And that awareness is the first form of independence. The next empire may not look powerful until it becomes unavoidable.